Trapjaw, wizard of weapons. With your deadly arsenal and your vicious steel jaw.
Hey everyone, I'm here today to take a look at the Mattel Master of the Universe Origins Trapjaw figure. Here's the packaging he comes in. See the Minicomic in the background there, and the very classic sort of vintage 80s looking card back. The back there as well. Now unfortunately I don't have the vintage Trapjaw card back, but I do have the vintage Triclops one, which was from the same wave. Just to compare there, you can see the different selection of characters on the back. And then here I have the Filmation Trapjaw figure card back, just to compare those two. Once again you see very similar with the instructions about how to attach the weapons and use the jaw. See, they're very similar layout to the instructions on the Filmation and the Origins card backs. And you can see the artwork along the top there. I always love this vintage card back artwork. I really like that they're kind of replicating that with the new Origins line, and they did with the Filmation line a couple of years ago as well. And now for the figure himself, based very, very closely on the vintage toy, but with more articulation. He comes with 3 accessories, which are the attachments for his arm that also attach to the belt. As you can see there, he's got a gun, a claw, and then the hook on the arm. You can see his arms both go out to the sides as well as going around. There's a swivel at the elbow as well as the elbow going forward and backwards. The hand has a pivot at the wrist as well as going around. The head will go back slightly, so it'll look a bit upwards, but there's not too much of a range of motion. You can get a bit of a nodding there in the mouth obviously, and the head will move from side to side. There's a joint at the elbow on the robot arm, which always feels like a big deal still, because that robot arm was so straight. And in the cartoon he couldn't move his robot arm at the elbow either, so it always seems like a big deal now when Trapjaw has a robotic arm that actually pivots at the elbow. And then the legs go out to the side and forwards and backwards. The knees will bend and also swivel around like that. And there's a boot pivot there too. And then the feet go forward and backwards a little bit, but it's quite hindered by the sculpt. They don't really move too much forward and backwards, but there is a nice pivot there as well to get poses out of. So the pivot from side to side works better than the forward and backwards motion on the ankles there. If I bring in the vintage Trapjaw here, you can see just how similar they are, apart from this new one being quite a bit taller, and that's mainly because the legs are longer. Because on the original the legs were actually really short, and I never noticed this when I was a kid, but now you do kind of realise just how short and stumpy the legs were. But other than that, the sculpt is almost exactly the same. Though I do prefer the face on the vintage line, and I felt this way about many faces as well, is that this sculpt on the face for the new figure just looks a bit soft, whereas on the original I feel that there's a lot more detailing to it. It's just more sort of definition to the face. It's kind of a softer look to the sculpt on the new figure. If you look up close there, you can definitely see the difference with how much softer that sculpt is on the new figure compared to the old, which is a shame really, because he's got a great face sculpt on that original toy, and the new one looks fine, but it's almost a bit cheap looking, and that's the same way I felt about Manny Faces' face sculpt as well. Like, it's just a bit cheaper. I don't know if it's the plastic that they can't get the detailing in the plastic they're using now. It's strange really, because you'd think it wouldn't be too hard for them to just replicate the original face if they're going for that. It's a shame. Also, the eyes on the original were green with black pupils, whereas on the new toy they're black with white pupils. And I've never seen Trapjaw depicted like that in any other media, so I'm not sure why they decided to do that. It does look kind of creepy. It's not a bad look, but once again, maybe it's just 'cause it's what I'm used to, because Trapjaw's always either had like green eyes on this vintage toy, or white or yellowish eyes with black pupils. So to have him with black eyes is kind of strange, but it's not necessarily a bad look. You can see the kind of magenta head is a lot more bright and red on the new toy as well, and the blue of his body is a lighter blue as well, whereas on the vintage one it was darker. but in the cartoon he was a lighter blue, so I guess this looks more like he did in the old Filmation series colour-wise. You can see the sculpting on the arm there is very similar as well. One thing that kind of impressed me is that the lower arm here, the forearm of Trapjaw, is almost identical to Man-E-Face's. If I bring in the Origins Man-E-Face's, you can see they look almost exactly the same, except for Trapjaw's has a couple of lines on it. So if Mattel had wanted to, they could have just reused the forearm from Man-E-Face's rather than sculpting a new one specifically for Trapjaw. But they did go to the effort of sculpting one especially for Trapjaw, just for that minor detail of the two lines, which I doubt anyone would have even noticed if they had just reused the Man-E-Face's arm. And you can see there that Trapjaw also shares the same leg mould as Man-E-Face's, which is the same as the vintage toy line. He kind of always has had the same legs as Man-E-Face's. You can see the leg detailing is the same on the new toy as it was on the vintage. Once again, like the face, I think the sculpting on the vintage toy was just a bit more defined than the slightly softer sculpt on the new toy. If you see these parts here, you can barely see the detailing on the thigh guards there, whereas on the original you can definitely see the detailing a lot easier because the sculpt is just a bit deeper. Also, just like the vintage toy, he's got that hoop on the top of his head where you can put string through it and have him use it as like a zip line on the top of his head, which I always thought was bizarre. As a kid I never even realised that's what the hoop on his head was for, because it didn't have any instructions on the box about that. And it's just so strange that that's how you would zip line through your head and hope that it doesn't snap your neck as you're swinging down there. It's just such a weird design choice and detail, but it's part of who Trapjaw is, so you've got to have that hoop on the head. I do like in the box art how they've incorporated the zip line onto his claw hand, so they've got the string kind of coming out the back there and going through the top of his head, which is something you could do with the toy. If you wanted to, you could tie a bit of string around the belt hook there and then clip this onto something so that he can then slide down, and you could put the bit of string through the loop on his head. And now for a look at the weapons that come with Trapjaw. It's the hook, gun and claw, which are pretty standard for coming with a Trapjaw. If we compare them to the originals, you'll see that they're very similar. One of the main differences is that the hook on the original Trapjaw didn't come with a belt hook on it. So if you wanted to attach it to the belt, you just had to use the actual hook itself, whereas this new version has a little hook on the end there to attach it to his belt, which is nice. The end of the gun is pointier on the new one rather than it was kind of rounder on the original. And one big difference is that on the original claw it's quite fat. You can see there it's kind of a quite wide claw, whereas on the new version it's very thin. See how thin that is? And that seems far more closely based on the Filmation Trapjaw's claw. I mean, it looks almost identical, as if they used the same sculpt. You can see there the same width. So it's strange, I don't know why they've done that really, made the claw thinner than the vintage toy line one. That's just a kind of curious little detail. Now just to compare the Filmation weapons. As I say, you'd almost think they'd use the same mould, except for the Filmation ones have a thicker peg, so you can't use the Filmation weapons on the Origins Trapjaw or vice versa. Now the weapons just plug in really simply. You just pull it out and then slide the next one in there. Very simple. It's a different size peg to the vintage toys weapons, so I've got the vintage Trapjaw gun here, that won't fit in there. It'll only fit in a little bit. Not that you need to anyway, because it comes with its own weapons, but just in case anyone was curious about that. The vintage weapons won't fit in there, nor will the Filmation attachments either. They're thicker. And for the attachments, if you want to put them on his belt, they easily just hook on there like that, just like the vintage toy. A curious thing about this Trapjaw is that this piece of armour, which on the vintage toy and most other Trapjaw toys is a separate piece, is actually a part of the sculpt. Like it's sculpted into his body. So Mattel have gone to the effort of creating a whole new body sculpt purely for Trapjaw, which seems strange. The only reason I can think is that because of the articulation in the shoulder here, the armour would kind of slide down into that gap if it was a separate piece. Though they could have just glued the separate piece on there rather than sculpting it, because I think it's a lot cheaper for them to produce armour than it is a whole new torso buck. So it's kind of a surprise really that they went to all that effort just for Trapjaw, rather than what I would have thought been the cheaper option of this being a separate piece that they glue on. But it's not detrimental to the toy at all. It doesn't really affect it that it's not a removable part or a separate piece. It still looks good. And here's the back of the figure. You can see where the belt attaches, and you could detach the belt if you wanted to. It's quite a tight fit where it clips on there, so I won't want to risk breaking them, because on the vintage toys quite often the belts would split if you opened and did them up too often, so I don't want to risk it with this. But if you wanted to take the belt off, you could. It's got the furry pants like He-Man. Mine has quite a few little paint splodges. You can see there, and there's also kind of a melted bit on the back there. Where I don't know if when the plastic came out of the mould or something, it left a little mark. There are quite a few at the top, the base of his neck there. Quite a few little splatters of paint on mine, on the chest there as well. It's just slightly sloppy. Nothing too major, but still stuff that you'd really prefer not be there. And like the rest of the Origins figures, his limbs are detachable, the arms and head at least. You can pop them off. And I've got Man-E-Face's arm there that you can put in. I have no idea why you'd want to, but you can if you want. The parts are all detachable, but it doesn't really look good, so I don't think I'll be using that feature very much. And now for some comparisons. You've got him next to the vintage toy there, and also the Filmation vintage style toy that came out a couple of years ago, which is a really nice version of Trapjaw. I wish he had the articulation that the Origins figure had, because I do like this sculpt. I think this head looks better than the new one. I think Trapjaw having a thicker jaw that protrudes more just looks better on him, because I mean he is Trapjaw. The jaw is a big part of him. I just think it looks better when it is a bit kind of wider and longer, like the animated version here. So it really protrudes, and this I mean this is true to the vintage toy, the jaw on the Origins figure, so I understand why they made it quite thin like that, but it's almost a little bit too small for me, but it still looks nice. You can see it's pretty much the same as the vintage Trapjaw's jaw. I still like that vintage Trapjaw face a lot more, looking at them together. And now here he is with the classics Trapjaw in the background there, which is once again very heavily based on the vintage toy line. He's got a really nice face sculpt. Well, as you can see, his eyes are white too, with the black pupils, as are the Filmation version and the 2000X version here. The 2000X version is the most drastic departure from that vintage look, because they were a kind of complete update and redesign, but still the basic parts are there. You know, this black piece of armour, the robot arm, the green belt with the skull and crossbones on it. Even the hoop on his head is still there. He's got kind of a spring jaw though, which I quite like. Though it is nice being able to pose the jaw open or closed if you want to, whereas you don't really have that choice with the 2000X toy. It's kind of always got to be closed. But yeah, just to give you an idea of what these different Trapjaws all look like together. Trapjaw is just a cool design in general, so it's very hard to make a bad looking Trapjaw toy. I mean, all 5 of these versions look good, but face wise he's probably my least favourite actually. I've got to admit, just the face just isn't as well detailed as a lot of the others. He hasn't got the character of the Filmation version, he hasn't got the detail of the vintage version. His head's also a bit rounder than the others that have a more of a kind of slightly thinner but longer head, almost like a Magneto helmet type head, whereas the new one is sort of a bit round and bulbous at the top, which I just don't think quite suits him. Now he comes with the same Minicomic that Man-E-Faces and Orko and Scareglow come with, which in the European market at least has had all the dialogue taken out, so no one can actually read and enjoy the comics. It's just kind of a picture book, but it's nice enough artwork. I don't really understand why they took the English language out. I guess it's because a lot of people in Europe don't speak English, but if this had English word bubbles in it, they wouldn't be able to read it. Without the word bubbles in, they still can't read it. So nothing's been accomplished other than ensuring that people who do speak English and read English can't read it. But oh well. And the story features Trapjaw. You can see him there with Scareglow. So that's my look at the Master Universe Origins Trapjaw. Really not bad toys for what they are. I mean, they're not too expensive. They're not collector toy prices because they're aimed more at kids. And for kids, so this would be a great little action figure. It's got a nice amount of articulation, got a nice lot of detail. I still wish they had the slightly better sculpting of the vintage toy line. I really don't know why the sculpting seems so much softer on these. But other than that, they are quite nice little toys. I think if you're a fan of Master Universe, it's worth picking at least some of them up to have in your collection. And I think if you're a parent wanting to buy these for your kid because you had them when you were a kid and you kind of want to try and pass the tradition on, these are perfect really. And I think that is who these toys are aimed at. So yeah, not too bad at all really. As someone who has a vintage collection and the Master Universe Classics adult collector line, these are a bit pointless. But I'm still glad I'm going to sort of cherry pick them. But they are quite nice figures to have. There is something fun about having the vintage style toys but with modern articulation. They're quite fun just to play around with, just to kind of pose in ways that we never could when we were kids. Well, thanks for watching everybody, and I'll catch you in the next video.